There are three branches of the government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Each branch interacts and influences the other differently. The role of the Supreme Court is to act as the highest court of appeal in the United Kingdom, ensuring that laws are applied correctly and protecting the rule of law. The composition of the Supreme Court consists of 12 justices who are appointed based on merit by the King on the advice of the Prime Minister and Lord Chancellor. There are many ways the Supreme Court can influence the executive and Parliament. The key operating principles of the Supreme Court are judicial neutrality and judicial independence, which ensure fair and impartial judgments free from external influence. Judicial neutrality is the principle that judges must remain impartial and base their decision solely on legal reasoning rather than personal or political beliefs. Judicial neutrality is upheld through a strict code of conduct, professional ethics, and the expectation that judges recuse themselves from cases where a conflict of interest could arise. The extent of judicial neutrality in the Supreme Court is generally high, though complete neutrality can be difficult due to human bias. An example of judicial neutrality occurred in 2020 when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Heathrow Airport's third runway despite environmental concerns, showing that legal reasoning outweighed political or social opinion. Judicial independence is the principle that judges must be free from interference or pressure from the executive, legislature, or any other external body. Judicial independence is upheld through security of tenure, independent appointment procedures, and protection of judicial salaries. The extent of judicial independence in the Supreme Court is very strong, as structural and legal safeguards ensure that judges can make decisions without political influence. An example of judicial independence occurred in 2019 when the Supreme Court ruled that Prime Minister Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament was unlawful, demonstrating that the judiciary can act independently of government. The Supreme Court influences the executive to a significant degree by holding the government accountable through judicial review and rulings that can limit executive actions. They do this by interpreting the law and determining whether government decisions or policies are lawful and consistent with constitutional principles. This influences the policymaking process by forcing the government to act within legal boundaries and sometimes to amend or withdraw policies. An example occurred in 2023 when the Supreme Court ruled the government's Rwanda asylum plan unlawful, directly affecting executive immigration policy. The Supreme Court influences Parliament to a limited degree by interpreting legislation and highlighting when laws conflict with constitutional or human rights principles. They do this through declarations of incompatibility under the Human Rights Act 1998, which signal that parliamentary laws may breach human rights obligations. An example occurred in 2018 when the Supreme Court ruled that Northern Ireland's abortion laws were incompatible with human rights standards, prompting parliamentary debate and reform. The doctrine of ultra vires is the principle that public bodies cannot act beyond the powers granted to them by law, and it affects the Supreme Court's influence over policy by allowing it to strike down unlawful executive actions. An example occurred in 2022 when the Supreme Court ruled that the Scottish Government acted beyond its powers by seeking to hold an independent referendum without Westminster's consent. Judicial review is the process where courts examine the lawfulness of actions or decisions made by public bodies, ensuring they comply with legal and constitutional limits. It affects the Supreme Court's influence over the policymaking process by allowing the judiciary to check government power and ensure accountability. An example occurred in 2021 when the Supreme Court ruled that the government's planning changes to Heathrow expansion required further environmental assessment, showing judicial oversight in policymaking. Parliament has influence over the executive through mechanisms such as scrutiny, questioning, select committees, and the power to approve or reject legislation and spending. Parliament is moderately effective at holding the executive to account, as shown in 2022 when Boris Johnson faced sustained scrutiny over the Partygate scandal that led to his resignation. The executive has influence over Parliament through control of the legislative timetable, the use of party discipline, and the power of the Prime Minister's majority to pass legislation. The executive is highly effective at exercising dominance over Parliament, as seen in 2020 when the government swiftly passed the Coronavirus Act with limited parliamentary scrutiny due to its large majority. The balance of power between Parliament and the executive has changed to a greater extent because parliamentary oversight has increased, as shown in 2019 when MPs forced the executive to publish legal advice on Brexit and delayed its plans through legislative votes. The balance of power between Parliament and the executive has changed to a lesser extent because strong party majorities still enable the government to control Parliament, as demonstrated in 2021 when the Conservative majority allowed the passage of the Nationality and Borders Act despite widespread opposition. The aims of the European Union are to promote peace, stability, and economic growth through the four freedoms of the single market alongside deeper political and economic union. The four freedoms of the single market are the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. These aims have been achieved to a greater extent through increased economic integration and cooperation, as shown in 2020 when the EU launched the €750 billion recovery fund to support member states during the COVID-19 pandemic. These aims have been achieved to a lesser extent due to political fragmentation and challenges to unity, as seen in 2016 when the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU, weakening the goal of political and economic union. The role of the European Union is to create a single market, uphold human rights, and ensure economic and political cooperation among member states, which has been achieved through policies such as the 2021 Green Deal aiming for net zero emissions by 2050. The impact of leaving the EU on UK parliamentary sovereignty was that Parliament regained full legislative control without being bound by EU law or the European Court of Justice. This impacted policy making by allowing the UK government to set independent trade, immigration, and environmental policies without EU oversight. An example of this was the introduction of the 2021 UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which demonstrated the UK's renewed freedom to negotiate trade deals independently. Legal sovereignty is the ultimate authority to make, amend, or repeal laws, which in the UK lies with Parliament. Political sovereignty is the practical ability to influence or determine how power is used, often exercised by the government on behalf of the electorate. Legal and political sovereignty are different because legal sovereignty refers to formal lawmaking power, while political sovereignty reflects where real decision-making influence lies. Sovereignty has moved between different branches to a greater extent as the judiciary has gained more influence, shown in 2019 when the Supreme Court ruled Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament unlawful, asserting judicial authority over the executive. Sovereignty has moved between different branches to a lesser extent because Parliament remains the ultimate lawmaking body, as shown in 2020 when it passed the Internal Market Act despite legal and political opposition. Sovereignty could be said to lie in the executive as the government often dominates the political agenda and decision-making, shown in 2020 when the executive swiftly implemented nationwide COVID-19 lockdowns using emergency powers with limited parliamentary approval. Sovereignty could be said to lie in the legislature as Parliament retains the ultimate authority to make and amend laws, shown in 2020 when MPs passed the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act to formally complete Brexit despite divisions across government. Sovereignty could be said to lie in the judiciary as the courts have the power to hold the executive and legislature to account, shown in 2019 when the Supreme Court ruled Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament unlawful, reinforcing judicial oversight over government actions. Thank you for watching this video on relations between the branches. I'll see you in the next one.